My name is Sarah Rivera, and at 32, I thought I understood the rhythms of Redwood Regional Medical Center in Forest View, California. As a registered nurse in the transplant unit, I'd spent the last 8 years navigating the delicate balance between hope and heartbreak that defined our work. The morning fog that rolled in from the Pacific each day seemed to mirror the uncertainty that hung over our patients' futures, but I'd always found comfort in the precision of our protocols and the integrity of our team. The first sign something was wrong came during a routine medication reconciliation meeting in late September. Hannah Taylor, our transplant coordinator, sat across from me in the sterile conference room, her usually warm demeanor replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. She'd been my mentor since I'd graduated nursing school, the one who'd helped me develop my clinical skills when I was a new graduate, fumbling with IV pumps and struggling to interpret lab values. "Sarah, we need to discuss some discrepancies in your documentation," she said, sliding a manila folder across the polished table. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face. I opened the folder, scanning the medication administration records inside. Everything appeared standard: post-transplant immunosuppressive protocols, dosing schedules, patient identifiers. "I'm not seeing any issues here, Hannah. These all look correct to me," she leaned, pointing to a timestamp on one of the forms. "This tacrolimus dose was documented as given at 0800, but the pharmacy shows it wasn't dispensed until 0830. That's a 30-minute discrepancy." The accusation hung in the air like the antiseptic smell that permeated every corner of our unit. I pulled out my phone, checking my personal notes from that shift. "I remember this patient. Mrs. Chen in room 314. The pharmacy was running behind that morning because of a system update." I documented the intended administration time, then gave the medication when it arrived. That's standard protocol when there are pharmacy delays. Hannah's expression didn't change. "The administration wants more precise documentation moving, no exceptions." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. In 8 years of working together, Hannah had never questioned my documentation practices. She'd been the one to teach me the importance of accurate record keeping, the one who'd praised my attention to detail during my annual reviews. Now she was treating me like a first-year student who couldn't be trusted with basic responsibilities. Over the following weeks, these meetings became more frequent. Hannah would call me into her office with increasing regularity, always with another folder, another discrepancy, another concern about my practice. The issues were minor: a decimal point in the wrong place, a signature that looked different from my usual handwriting, a medication given 5 minutes outside the prescribed window due to a patient emergency. Each time, I provided explanations. Each time, she documented my responses with the mechanical precision of someone building a case rather than seeking understanding. The Hannah I'd known, the one who'd celebrated my engagement, who'd covered my shifts when my father was in the hospital, who'd written glowing recommendations for my specialty certifications, seemed to have vanished, replaced by this cold, calculating stranger. The other nurses began to notice. Cameron Taylor from the day shift pulled me aside one afternoon, his voice low as we stood near the medication dispensing unit. "Everything okay with you and Hannah? She's been asking a lot of questions about your patient assignments lately." "What kind of questions?" "Medication timing, documentation practices, whether you've seemed stressed or distracted." "It's weird, Sarah. She's never shown that level of interest in anyone else's work." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my apartment, listening to the distant sound of traffic on Highway 101. The fog had rolled in thick, obscuring the hills beyond my window, and I felt equally lost in the murky uncertainty of my situation. Hannah's behavior made no sense. My patient outcomes were excellent, my documentation had always been thorough, and I'd never received anything but positive feedback from supervisors and colleagues. The next morning brought another meeting request. This time Hannah's office felt different, more formal, more threatening. She'd arranged the chairs differently, positioning herself behind her desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. The familiar family photos and nursing awards that usually decorated her space seemed to watch me with accusatory eyes. "Sarah, I need to inform you that I'll be conducting a comprehensive review of your recent cases," she announced, her voice devoid of the warmth that had once made her office feel like a safe haven. "There have been concerns raised about patterns in your practice that require investigation." The words hit me like a physical blow. Patterns. Investigation. These weren't the terms of mentorship or constructive feedback. They were the language of formal disciplinary action. As I walked back to the nurses' station, my badge felt heavier against my chest, and the familiar sounds of the unit, monitors beeping, phones ringing, conversations between colleagues, seemed muffled and distant. Something was very wrong at Redwood Regional Medical Center, and I was beginning to suspect that I was at the center of it. The investigation Hannah mentioned began immediately. Within hours of our meeting, I received an email requesting all my patient documentation from the previous 3 months. The tone was clinical, impersonal. Nothing like the collaborative reviews we'd conducted during my early days at Redwood Regional. I remembered those first months vividly. Fresh out of nursing school at UC Davis, I'd arrived at the transplant unit feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of postoperative care protocols. Hannah Taylor had been assigned as my preceptor, and she'd transformed what could have been a terrifying transition into a masterclass in clinical excellence. "Watch how I organize my medication passes," she'd said during my second week. Her movements precise and methodical as she prepared morning doses for our kidney transplant patients. "Every detail matters in transplant care. These patients have waited years for their second chance. We can't afford mistakes." She'd taught me to read the subtle signs of rejection, to recognize when immunosuppression levels needed adjustment, to communicate with families during the most vulnerable moments of their lives. Under her guidance, I developed confidence in managing complex medication regimens, understanding drug interactions, and maintaining the delicate balance required for successful transplant outcomes. "You have excellent instincts, Sarah," she'd told me after I'd caught a potential drug interaction that could have compromised a patient's new liver. "Trust yourself, but always double-check. That's what separates good nurses from great ones." For 2 years, Hannah had been more than a supervisor. She'd been a mentor, advocate, and friend. When I'd struggled with a particularly challenging family situation, she'd stayed late to help me navigate the conversation. When I'd considered applying for the charge nurse position, she'd written a glowing recommendation that highlighted my clinical skills and dedication to patient care. Now, as I compiled the requested documentation, I couldn't reconcile that supportive mentor with the cold administrator who'd sat across from me yesterday. Every interaction felt calculated. Every question seemed designed to trap rather than teach. The first red flag appeared 3 days later. Cameron Mitchell from pharmacy called me during my lunch break, his voice tense with confusion. "Sarah, I need to ask you about a discrepancy report that came through yesterday. It shows you documented giving Mrs. Chen her tacrolimus at 0800, but the medication wasn't actually dispensed from the Pyxis until 0830. Can you explain the timing difference?" I pulled up Mrs. Chen's chart on my phone, scrolling through the medication administration record. The timestamps were clear. I'd scanned the medication at 0800 and documented administration immediately afterward. The Pyxis logs should have matched perfectly. "Cameron, I'm looking at the MAR right now. I definitely pulled that medication at 0800. There might be a system glitch." That's what I thought too, but Hannah submitted this as a medication error. "She's requesting a formal review of your documentation practices." The phone felt heavy in my hand. Hannah had submitted a medication error report without speaking to me first, without giving me a chance to explain or investigate the discrepancy. This violated every principle of collaborative problem-solving she'd taught me. Over the next week, similar reports began surfacing. A timing discrepancy with morning insulin. A question about whether I'd properly witnessed a controlled substance waste. Each incident was minor, the kind of documentation variance that typically warranted a quick conversation and system correction. Instead, Hannah was treating them as of systematic negligence. Diana Foster, one of the evening shift nurses, pulled me aside after receiving report one Thursday night. "Sarah, something's not right. Hannah's been asking me to verify your documentation from previous shifts, looking for inconsistencies. She's never done that before. Not with anyone." "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Medication timing, patient assessment notes, even your break documentation." It's like she's building a case against you." Diana's expression was troubled. "I've worked with you for 2 years. Your documentation is some of the most thorough I've seen. This doesn't make sense." That weekend, I decided to conduct my own investigation. Using my access to the hospital's Epic system, I reviewed every medication administration record from the past month, cross-referencing timestamps with Pyxis logs and patient charts. What I discovered made my stomach drop. The discrepancies were real, but they weren't random system glitches. Someone had been systematically altering timestamps in the medication dispensing system, creating artificial gaps between when medications were pulled and when they were documented as given. The pattern was subtle but consistent, always small enough to seem like honest mistakes, but frequent enough to suggest incompetence or negligence. More disturbing was the realization that these alterations required administrative access to the Pyxis system. Only a handful of people had the clearance to modify dispensing records after the fact, and as transplant coordinator, Hannah was one of them. Monday morning brought the confrontation I'd been dreading. Hannah called me into her office before my shift began, her expression grave as she gestured to a thick folder on her desk. "Sarah, I've completed my review of your recent documentation. I'm afraid I've identified a pattern of medication errors that requires immediate administrative attention." She opened the folder, revealing printouts of every discrepancy report she'd filed. Each page was meticulously organized, highlighting timing differences and documentation variances with yellow marker. To an outside observer, it would look like compelling of systematic negligence. "These errors represent a serious threat to patient safety," Hannah continued, her voice taking on the formal tone of an official reprimand. "I'm recommending immediate suspension pending a full investigation by the nursing administration." The betrayal was complete. The woman who had taught me to trust my instincts, who had advocated for my professional development, who had helped me become the nurse I was today, had systematically sabotaged my career. She'd used her administrative access to create false, then presented it as proof of my incompetence. As I sat in that familiar office, surrounded by the awards and photos that had once represented safety and mentorship, I realized that Hannah Taylor had been playing a much longer game than I'd understood. The question wasn't why she was doing this. It was how long she'd been planning it, and what she hoped to gain from my professional destruction. The silence stretched between us as she waited for my response, her eyes cold and calculating. For the first time since arriving at Redwood Regional Medical Center, I felt truly alone. The weight of Hannah's accusations settled over me like a suffocating blanket, but beneath the shock, something else was crystallizing, a cold, methodical determination. I'd spent 3 years learning from her, absorbing her lessons about attention to detail and systematic thinking. Now I would use those same skills against her. "I'd like to request copies of all documentation you're referencing," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "as well as the original Pyxis logs for comparison." Hannah's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Sarah, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. These aren't allegations, they're documented facts." "Then the documentation should speak for itself," I leaned, meeting her gaze directly. "I'm also requesting that any investigation include a review of administrative access logs for the periods in question." For just a moment, something flickered across Hannah's face. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. She recovered quickly, but I'd seen it. The mentor who had taught me to read micro-expressions in patients had just revealed her own tell. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Though I should warn you that challenging these findings will only complicate your situation. The nursing administration takes medication errors very seriously." Within an hour, I was sitting across from Director of Nursing Cameron Mitchell, Hannah's carefully prepared folder spread between us. Cameron had been at Redwood Regional for 15 years, his reputation built on fairness and thorough investigation. If anyone would see through Hannah's manipulation, it would be him. "These are serious allegations, Sarah," Cameron said, reviewing the documentation. "Hannah has outlined a pattern of errors spanning several months. Can you explain these discrepancies?" I'd prepared for this moment during the longest hour of my career. "Director Mitchell, I believe these records have been altered. I'm requesting a forensic review of the Pyxis system logs, specifically focusing on any administrative modifications made after the original dispensing events. Cameron's expression sharpened. That's a significant accusation. You're suggesting that a senior staff member has falsified documentation? I'm suggesting that deserves closer scrutiny. Hannah Taylor has administrative access to modify Pyxis records. I'm requesting that the investigation include a review of when these modifications were made and by whom. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of hospital machinery. Cameron studied the papers again, his experienced eye catching details that might have escaped a less thorough administrator. I'm going to place you on administrative leave pending investigation, he said finally. But I'm also going to request IT support for a comprehensive audit of the medication dispensing system. If there's been any tampering with official records, we need to know. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of anxiety and forced inactivity. I couldn't access the hospital systems, couldn't review my own documentation, couldn't even enter the building without escort. The isolation was deliberate and effective, a standard procedure designed to prevent interference with ongoing investigations. But Hannah had underestimated one crucial factor: the relationships I'd built with my colleagues over 3 years of dedicated service. On Wednesday evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Diana Martinez, one of the ICU nurses I'd worked with during my orientation. Coffee tomorrow? I have something you need to see. We met at a small cafe 6 blocks from the hospital, far enough away to avoid accidental encounters with hospital staff. Diana looked nervous as she slid a manila envelope across the table. I wasn't sure if I should get involved, she said quietly, but what's happening to you isn't right. I've been watching Hannah's behavior since the investigation started, and something's been bothering me. Inside the envelope were printouts of Pyxis access logs that Diana had discreetly photographed during her shifts. The timestamps told a damning story. Administrative modifications to medication records, all made during off hours when the units were minimally staffed, all traced back to Hannah's access credentials. She's been staying late almost every night for the past 2 months, Diana explained. I thought she was just catching up on paperwork. But look at these timestamps. She was accessing the Pyxis system at midnight, 2 in the morning, times when no legitimate medication administration would be occurring. The PER was overwhelming. Hannah had been systematically altering records, creating discrepancies where none existed, building a case against me one falsified entry at a time. The pattern was so methodical, so carefully constructed, that it spoke to months of planning. Why would she do this? Diana asked, voicing the question that had been haunting me. I'd been thinking about that constantly during my suspension. I think it started when I questioned the transplant protocol discrepancies. Hannah realized I was getting too close to something she didn't want exposed. Destroying my credibility was easier than addressing whatever she's been hiding. Armed with Diana's, I requested an emergency meeting with Cameron Mitchell. The IT audit was already underway, but Diana's documentation provided the smoking gun that would accelerate the investigation. Cameron's face grew increasingly grim as he reviewed the access logs. These modifications were made well after the original medication administrations. There's no legitimate reason for a transplant coordinator to be accessing general floor Pyxis records at these times. Director Mitchell, I said carefully, I think this goes beyond falsifying my records. Hannah has been making unauthorized changes to the medication dispensing system for months. We need to determine what else she might have altered. The investigation expanded rapidly. IT forensic specialists were brought in to conduct a comprehensive audit of the Pyxis system. Every administrative modification made in the past 6 months was scrutinized, cross-referenced with legitimate clinical needs and staff schedules. What they found was staggering. Hannah had been systematically altering medication records across multiple units, not just mine. The pattern suggested a sophisticated scheme to manipulate inventory data, possibly for financial gain or to cover up missing controlled substances. On Friday afternoon, Cameron called me back to his office. This time, Hannah was conspicuously absent from the meeting. Sarah, I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. The forensic audit has confirmed that your medication records were falsified. Hannah Taylor has been placed on immediate suspension pending criminal investigation. The allegations against you are being withdrawn, and you're cleared to return to duty." The vindication felt hollow. 3 years of trust, mentorship, and professional growth had been shattered by someone I'd considered a role model. The woman who had taught me the importance of integrity in healthcare had been systematically violating every principle she'd claimed to uphold. "There's more," Cameron continued. "The audit revealed extensive manipulation of controlled substance records. We're working with the DEA and State Licensing Board to determine the full scope of Hannah's activities. Your willingness to challenge these allegations may have uncovered a much larger problem." As I walked out of Cameron's office, my badge reactivated and my reputation restored. I felt a complex mixture of relief and loss. Justice had been served, but the cost had been the destruction of a relationship that had shaped my early career. Hannah Taylor, the mentor who had guided my professional development, had betrayed not just me, but every principle she'd claimed to represent. The investigation was far from over, but my part in it was shifting from victim to witness. The silence that had once felt oppressive now carried the weight of truth finally being acknowledged. 8 months later, I stood in the break room of Coastal Valley Medical Center, watching the morning fog roll across the hills through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was different here, softer somehow, without the sharp edges that had defined my years at Redwood Regional. My new position as Senior Clinical Coordinator had brought unexpected opportunities. The administration here valued transparency, implementing systems that made the kind of systematic fraud Hannah had perpetrated nearly impossible. Electronic medication tracking required dual verification, and controlled substance audits occurred monthly rather than quarterly. The criminal trial had concluded 3 weeks ago. Hannah Taylor received 18 months in federal prison for healthcare fraud and controlled substance diversion. The investigation revealed she'd been selling diverted medications through an elaborate network using falsified records to cover the missing inventory. My case had been the thread that unraveled everything. Cameron Martinez had testified as a character witness for me during the proceedings. He'd been promoted to Chief Nursing Officer at Redwood Regional, tasked with rebuilding the department's integrity protocols. We'd maintained professional contact, sharing best practices between our facilities. "Sarah, the new orientation group is ready for your presentation." Diana Thompson, my current supervisor, appeared in the doorway. Her approach to leadership was collaborative rather than hierarchical, a refreshing change that had helped restore my faith in healthcare administration. The presentation I developed focused on recognizing and reporting professional misconduct. It had become my specialty, born from hard experience. I advocate for stronger oversight of administrative decision-making, pushing for systems that protect both patients and staff from the kind of manipulation I'd endured. The new graduates listened intently as I outlined the warning signs I'd missed, the importance of documentation, and the courage required to challenge authority when something felt wrong. Their faces reminded me of my own uncertainty years ago, when Hannah had first taken me under her wing. "Trust your instincts," I told them. "Professional relationships should elevate your practice, not compromise your integrity. If something doesn't align with your training or values, investigate further." After the session, I returned to my office overlooking the hospital's healing garden. The space was mine. No shared workspace, no constant supervision, no fear of someone accessing my computer to plant false. The autonomy felt earned rather than given. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chen, now working at a trauma center in San Diego. He'd been instrumental in supporting me through the investigation, and we'd maintained our friendship despite the geographic distance. His message was simple. "Saw the news about the new medication tracking system you implemented. Proud of you." The system he referenced had been my first major initiative at Coastal Valley. Working with the pharmacy and IT departments, we'd created a blockchain-based tracking system that made medication record tampering virtually impossible. The model was being studied by other facilities across the state. As the afternoon shift arrived, I gathered my belongings and headed toward the parking garage. The routine felt peaceful now. No anxiety about what I might find in my locker. No fear of false accusations waiting in my email. The drive home took me past Redwood Regional Medical Center, I no longer felt the sharp pang of betrayal when I saw the familiar buildings. Hannah's actions had been her choice, not a reflection of my judgment or the institution itself. The hospital had implemented new oversight protocols, and several staff members had reached out to thank me for exposing the fraud that had affected them too. At home, I opened my laptop to review applications for the mentorship program I'd established. Young healthcare professionals needed guidance, but they also needed mentors who understood the importance of ethical boundaries. The program paired experienced staff with new graduates, but included mandatory training on professional conduct and reporting procedures. The evening news played in the background as I worked. Healthcare fraud cases had become more prominent in recent months, with several high-profile prosecutions across the country. The reporter mentioned that whistleblower protections were being strengthened, making it safer for healthcare workers to report misconduct. My phone rang. A call from a nurse in Oregon who'd heard about my experience through professional networks. She was facing a similar situation with falsified documentation and needed advice on how to proceed. These calls had become regular, connecting me with healthcare workers across the country who were navigating their own professional betrayals. Document everything, I advised her. Trust the process but verify the results. And remember, protecting patients and your profession is worth the temporary discomfort of challenging authority. After the call, I sat in my garden as twilight settled over the valley. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet that had marked my final months at Redwood Regional. This silence carried peace rather than resolution rather than fear. Hannah Taylor's betrayal had cost me 3 years of professional relationships and months of emotional turmoil. But it had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and led me to a position where I could prevent others from experiencing similar violations of trust. The investigation, the trial, the career transition, all of it had finally reached its natural. The woman who had taught me about integrity while systematically violating it was serving her sentence. The systems that had enabled her fraud were being reformed. The young professionals I now mentored would enter their careers with better protection and clearer guidance. I closed my laptop and turned off the porch light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to strengthen the profession I'd chosen to serve. But tonight, for the first time in over a year, I felt complete peace with the path that had brought me here. It was finally over, and the silence felt earned.